Hey guys, this is the Chapter 9 review. The big topic here is the early republic. So the first thing, the story at the beginning of Chapter 9 is an example of a lot of very, very shocking frustration. I say shocking, frustration from many farmers and frustration at the financial elite. Now, we covered earlier in the semester that in the United States, early on, there was not a huge gap between rich and poor like there was in Britain and more established European empires, and really the rest of the world. But there still was a noticeable difference. And the fact that there were people who were less well off than others wasn't really a problem in early American history. It was only a problem whenever certain laws or policies or taxes were set up which were clearly designed to enrich the elite at the expense of the regular farmer. Now, another big important theme in this chapter, more than just people who have less and people who have more, is a very different lifestyle altogether. So in our lifestyle today, everyone is linked into a big commercial mass consumption economy. And you either have people who have very little or nothing, and then you have people who have a lot, but everybody's in the same economy. Back at the beginning of the United States, again, this is before industrialization, not everybody was in the same economy. You had a developing commercial economy, and when you hear commercial, try to wipe away the association with like TV advertisements. When we say commercial, we're typically talking about trading goods. We're talking about commerce. We're talking about merchants, overseas trade. We're talking about, things that make the economy go. Now, the important distinction is that the commercial economy is developing, but it's not developing for the vast majority of Americans. Now, that sounds like, that sucks for those Americans that don't get a benefit from that. Actually, most Americans didn't care about the commercial economy because, again, the way it is now is that everybody cares about the economy because it affects all of us. But early on in American history, before the Industrial Revolution, the vast majority of Americans lived out in the countryside and they had their own farms. And they grew and made most everything they needed. And the things that they did not make themselves, they would barter for, trade for. So most Americans, and again, a very healthy majority, were not connected to some national economy, and certainly not connected to an international economy. But there were some who, again, lived in places like Boston or Philadelphia, Charleston. There were some colonists, but again, a minority, who were connected to a larger economy. And so their interests were, whenever they were thinking about what changes should take place in American history, or what should our values be in this new America, or what should the point of the government be, those people are thinking how to grow the economy, how to make the United States more powerful overall. So they have more of an association with the United States in general because they see it as economic potential. Whereas most Americans, they're not concerned with that. They're more concerned with being self-sufficient, being not only involved with local politics, but having a real voice, being able to make a difference. So for that reason, most Americans early on, after the Constitution, during this era, during the early republic, were primarily concerned with local matters. And the more local, the more they were concerned, and the further away, the less they were concerned. In fact, most Americans, when they thought of a federal government, when they ever did think of it, which was nowhere near as often as it's thought of now, they just wanted it to stay away from them, stay out of their business. So it's interesting then that one of the themes of American history from then until now is an ever-growing importance of a commercial economy. Now, don't make the mistake of assuming that it was inevitable. It certainly did happen. So in that sense, you could say it was inevitable. It was always going to happen. But choices were made, laws were enacted, policies were set forth that caused the United States to move in that direction along with the rest of the world. An interesting thing to consider is, if the vast majority of Americans did not want or at least care about a large commercial economy, then how come the United States steadily moved in that direction? And so there's many answers, but one of the most obvious seems to be that the minority had more influence in the government. And that brings up other questions like, well, how? What about them? So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of analyze the two different groups. The overwhelming majority of the country will be associated with terms like backcountry dwellers, rural farmers. Semi-subsistence farming is a very popular phrase that is used by a lot of history books. Basically, subsistence farming is, of course, growing or making everything you need, so you're self-sufficient. The reason they use semi-subsistence, as you can imagine, is that they don't grow quite everything they need. There still is some trading going on. There still is a surplus, but because they're predominantly self-sufficient, it's still semi-subsistence. On the one side, you have all that, and then on the other side, you have the cities. You have the commercial elite. You have those who are primarily interested in growing the country, growing the economy. And so those two values are very much different. The really important thing to do is, if you start from there, then all of the other topics we're going to cover in this chapter make a lot more sense. Because we're going to talk about Federalists versus Republicans. The differences are grounded in what we're talking about here. We're going to talk about people who prefer allying with the French versus allying with the British. That is also connected to this concept. Every major debate or crisis that we're going to cover, if you understand this foundation, it's going to make it much easier for you to understand almost all of the different disagreements or crises in American history during the early republic. I'm going to go back to semi-subsistence versus the commercial elite several times. You're going to hear me say that, and just know I'm referencing this, the difference in values. Now, the reason I brought up backcountry versus city is because typically those who want the government to leave them alone and those who are farmers, they live in the backcountry. Those who live in the city, more interested in commercial opportunities, growth of the economy. To give you a comparison of something we've already covered with the Constitution, semi-subsistence farmers are less enthusiastic about the Constitution. They may have preferred the Articles of Confederation or total state independence, while the city dwellers are going to be more pro-Constitution, because again, the Constitution is a tightening of the unification of the states. It is a tightening of the governing of the states. It is an increase of the power of the federal government. And of course, central management is better for efficiency, and central management is better for the growth of the national economy. It almost seems odd to people to hear that there are people who genuinely don't care if the economy improves. They don't need the economy because, again, they're not connected to it. They're primarily self-sufficient. So their values aren't obtaining more money or obtaining more stuff. Their values are successfully maintaining their property, successfully raising their children with the values that they have, successfully participating in their community. And all those values may sound nice and positive to people now, but they're very, very foreign from what people typically experience now. When people think about politics, they think about federal politics. When people think about how to improve their lives, they necessarily think about obtaining more money and more material possessions. And the national or even now global economy is very much an overriding factor there. Another element of this backcountry versus city debate is the backcountry really wanted to be left alone, and they didn't really have much of an interest in telling city folk how to behave either. Whereas in order for the commercial economy to grow, the whole country needed to be integrated. So you have the backcountry dwellers, those anti-federalists who are also Republicans, and we'll talk more about the political parties later. They want the government to be weak because they are primarily concerned with their independence and their civil liberties being threatened by a too powerful government. So if their primary concern is individual liberty, then they will willingly sacrifice the opportunity for commercial growth. If their values don't cause them to define success by an accumulation of wealth, then it doesn't matter to them. They don't see it as a bad thing that the commercial economy will not grow. Whereas those in the city, they do define their lives and their success by an accumulation of wealth. They do not prioritize self-sufficiency. They see it as inefficient. They not only want to improve opportunities for themselves, but they want the entire federal government to do whatever it takes and impact other people's lives in necessary ways to make that a reality. So to compare that to modern day concepts, one is more libertarian than the other. the anti-Federalists, the semi-subsistence farmers, the Republicans back then, tended to want the government to leave them alone. And the city dwellers, those prioritizing a commercial economy, they wanted the government to get in everyone's business, so to speak. And so as a result, the backcountry, they would argue that whenever this new United States is being set up, if the federal government is too powerful, it makes it much easier for some rich Bostonian commercial elitist to change laws that impact someone living in the backcountry of Georgia. And to them, that doesn't make sense. And it's not as if these backcountry dwellers are interested in imposing laws that enforce their values on people different than them. They just wanted government to reflect the wishes of a local populace, which again, anti-federalists, that was a big concern of theirs. So hopefully you're making these connections here. Let's talk about the first constitutional government. Now, the new government was to be headed by George Washington. He was to be president. He was the only unanimously elected president ever. He was elected in 1792. President was not elected directly by the people. The vast majority of founding fathers were elitist. They believed that the average person was not well suited to become too influential in the political system. One way to insulate such an important decision like who's going to be president from the supposed inferior decision-making process of the masses was to make sure that there were electors who were picked by the state governments who would then go on and do the election of the president. So that's why there actually was a unanimous victory at this point. Now, the president will select a team of advisors for extremely important national policy. And the most important that we're going to talk the most about was Alexander Hamilton. He is going to be named Secretary of Treasury, and he was a staunch Federalist. So if we were to look at like a sliding scale between Federalists and Republicans, Federalists are, pro-Constitution, pro-big government, whereas Republicans are anti-Federalists, smaller government, more local focus. Well, anyway, on this side, at the very tip was Alexander Hamilton. I mean, he probably would have been fine with a monarchy. Alexander Hamilton, who had one of the most important jobs, was a hardcore federal government proponent. Alexander Hamilton, his goal, of course, being a Federalist, was to improve the nation's economy, to grow the nation's power. Obviously, when he's looking at what his role should be, if his values or his mission is to grow the economy, to make it stronger, to make the country more of a commercial economic powerhouse, he sees the two biggest problems facing that agenda. One, the country or the federal government has no income, so he needs to fix that. And also, the country's in a lot of debt from the Revolutionary War. So Hamilton decided that paying off the debt as soon as possible, that's the best plan of action. He's going to develop a system to raise revenue in order to pay off debt. Now, the system that he develops will definitely favor the commercial elite at the expense of, the regular farmer. And that's going to make it controversial. Many things that Hamilton will do will be controversial. There'll be a lot of infighting within the Washington administration because he and Thomas Jefferson in particular disagree on so many values. Part of Hamilton's strategy was he wanted to assume the debt of the states, that is, pay off the debt that the states had incurred during the war. And so if the federal government pays off the states' debt along with its own debt, this would build up strong credit with other countries, which again was very important. The United States needed access to capital. And so how do you get capital that you don't already have? Well, loans. Hamilton also, he wanted to set everything up in such a way to have certain powerful elements of society, whether it be elected officials or some of the rich and powerful people in the country. He wanted to find ways to align their interests with the federal government. So he knew that human beings are typically primarily looking after their own interests, whether it was members of the federal government, elected officials, having a relationship with the national bank, which is something we're going to talk about. He's going to try to set up the government in a certain way to align the interests of the economic, financial elite with that of the success of the country. It worked. And there's a lot of things you could say about that. Sometimes people look back to see what are the origins of the United States becoming an economically driven country. This is definitely part of that story, if not the genesis of it. So part of Hamilton's effort will be to establish a national bank. There's going to be a big debate over this national bank. Hamilton argues that it's necessary for his goals, which again are growing the U.S. economy. But people like Jefferson thought that the bank was a bad idea because of conflict of interest, because it gave the financial elite an inside path to political decisions that were being made. Hamilton didn't mind if the few and the rich were the ones who dominated decision-making in the country, whereas Jefferson wanted to distribute decision-making more broadly. He wanted a larger section of the country to have a say. This is also one of the earliest constitutional debates, or one of the first major constitutional debates, because Jefferson and James Madison, who wrote the dang thing for the most part, argued that the Constitution made it clear that the federal government was not allowed to do things that the Constitution didn't say explicitly that it had the power to do. Whereas Hamilton said that that was unnecessarily too strict and specific. Hamilton said that a broader interpretation of the U.S. Constitution was necessary for the country to work at all, to survive or grow or prosper. And Hamilton used the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution basically to argue that there are implied powers, that it doesn't have to just say it explicitly, whereas Madison and Jefferson thought that that was intentionally disingenuous. Or in other words, that Hamilton would make whatever argument he needed to get the practical result he wanted, which was a growing economy, a more powerful national government. Madison and Jefferson warned that if the federal government could broadly interpret the Constitution, that basically it would decide the limits of its own power. They reasoned that if the federal government can decide how far its power goes, then there's nothing really to stop it from becoming more and more powerful into infinity. At the end of the day, Hamilton won the debate with George Washington. Another element of the controversy over this national bank was that most Americans didn't like banks. There weren't that many. Nowadays, it's a normal thing for people to put their money in a bank. Then it wasn't. You had many prominent members of the early republic equate banks with houses of prostitution, that they were immoral. A minority of Americans liked the idea of a national bank. Guess what? They were Federalists. They were the financial elite, and they're eventually going to get their way. Economically speaking, Hamilton's programs worked well. The United States established good credit. The federal government was able to handle economic issues that came its way. Revenue came in. So from the perspective of someone who wanted to grow the economy and improve the financial situation of the economic elite, it absolutely worked. Let's talk about the political party. Most founding fathers disliked the idea of political parties. Washington never officially declared that he was part of a party, but because he favored Hamilton's ideas most of the time, he was by default a Federalist. Nearly none of the founding fathers liked the idea of political parties, but they're going to establish them, and they're going to utilize them. And the biggest reason why they didn't like political parties was probably pretty obvious to all of us. If a political party becomes the primary allegiance of a person, then they can actually hope for harm to their country in order to hurt the other political party. Political parties can create a problem with priorities. Political parties also can corrupt people's thinking. For whatever reason, people are inclined to groupthink. That is, instead of independently problem solving and thinking about something on their own, based on their own value system, people tend to latch onto a group and sometimes substitute independent rational thought with something that someone from their faction has said that packages it nice and neatly. So whether it's groupthink, whether it's more loyalty to your faction than to the country overall, these were big problems for a lot of the founding fathers when it came to political parties. But despite all that, parties will become commonplace. It's pretty much inevitable in a republic. Most people feel more comfortable choosing a general side, certain things in common, and having to go to the trouble of independently deciding on every issue. Them versus us is a popular mentality. Tribalism, whether it's college football, whether it's politics, whether it's nationalism, people feel more comfortable attaching themselves to a side of something. They're much more likely to view their side as positive, and they're much more likely to view the other side, the opposition, as negative. That's just the way people operate. And the United States, in this way, was no exception. Alexander Hamilton and those that supported a more powerful federal government and who preferred a country dominated by the financial elite and who emphasized growing the national economy over other things, they're going to be the Federalists, and those who oppose all of that stuff, they're going to be the Republicans. All right, so let's talk about some early American foreign policy. And the biggest foreign policy conundrum in the early Republic was definitely what was going on between France and Britain. France had been an absolutist monarchy since the early 1600s, and they had a king for its entire history before that. Well, in 1791, France experienced a revolution and eventually overthrew that monarchy. And that wasn't the plan at the beginning. It was a big global shock. During the early months and years of the French Revolution, the United States overwhelmingly supported it for obvious reasons. Here is another country that is throwing off a king. Here is a country that is trying to establish a republic. Here's a country who's talking about the inalienable rights and things like that. So very obvious similarities with the American Revolution. But things are going to change. In late 1793, the revolution turned ugly. Radical factions and gangs of urban workers took control of the revolution and unleashed what is known to history as the Reign of Terror. That gives you an idea of what it was like. The Reign of Terror resulted in hundreds of politically motivated beheadings a day. Even before the terror, the revolution had attacked religion. It was an attempt to get rid of Christianity, replace it with the cult of reason. These things were not in common with American values. The streets of Paris running red with blood, the elimination of religion, the state-ordered elimination of religion. These things were very important to Americans and changed the attitude about the French Revolution. Now, France and Britain were at war with one another, like pretty much always since we've started this class. And so the United States, which is trying to grow its economy, necessarily needs to trade with the French or French colonies or the British or British colonies in order to continue economic growth. So the United States has a choice to make. Join France, despite all the problems I just mentioned. Join Britain, even though that would be the United States going back on its treaty obligations. Or go neutral and take neither side. Well, President Washington is going to choose the last one. Stay neutral. Washington believed unless there was a clear-cut ally that the United States should stay out of European wars. So now we're going to talk about how that neutrality went. You would think like, oh, okay, that's the safe option. No, it just pisses both of them off, both France and Britain. The United States tried to continue to trade with both France and Britain, but neither European power would accept this. Both countries raided and confiscated American ships. That, of course, disrupted trade. It also cost the United States economy a lot of money. It was not a sustainable thing. The British, they're going to shut down trade in the Caribbean, and that was extremely important to the American economy. The United States was nowhere near strong enough to fight Britain on these issues, so they're going to try to make a treaty. And the treaty, which is known as Jay's Treaty, it's going to be largely a failure. It doesn't really do anything to address the economic problems. Really, all it does is the British agree to pay for some damages over ship confiscations, but it doesn't change policy. Except the British agreed to remove their garrisons that were still in American territory. So the British still had forts in land that was designated to be American by that Treaty of Paris. So Jay's Treaty wasn't very popular. It wasn't very significant. It was really the biggest thing to take away from that is it was a failure to get anything significant done. Politics during this time. Politics got very fierce. Lots of times people think that, well, only recently have politicians been disrespectful to one another and misbehaved, and that people used to be gentlemanly and, they were so well-spoken and they treated each other with dignity. No, the 1790s were arguably the most hostile time in American politics. The big story in politics during this era was a fundamental disagreement on the size and power of the federal government. This big debate led to the formation of political parties. Though many of the founding fathers, like I said earlier, did not like the idea of political parties, in order to get things done effectively, they were deemed useful and effective. Now, one interesting element of the very first example of political parties was that the Federalists were the ones who had formed the government. Washington, though didn't really call himself a Federalist. He was one. His administration was largely Federalist, especially after Thomas Jefferson quit. That meant that the opposition had a problem. The opposition had to be careful that they didn't look seditious. Seditious, S-E-D-I-T-I-O-U-S. Sedition is actively working against something, undermining something. And so, of course, today in our political system, it's well established that there are two parties and they fight over who gets to use the hugely powerful federal government to tell everybody else what to do. That's a normal thing. But before the American Revolution, typically you would have a government, and anyone who was against the government was not just a opposition party with a different idea about how best to run the country. It was someone who wanted to overthrow the government completely. They were against the government. So that was a controversy. So what that meant is that for the Republicans, like Jefferson and Madison, they had to carefully navigate between effective opposition to the Federalists, but then also not being painted as seditious or anti-American. So the election of 1796, Washington was immensely popular. Washington was so popular that despite the fact that a lot of the Federalist policies that he ended up supporting not being popular, his popularity personally overcame a lot of that. Now, not with everyone. Certainly, there was a lot of very angry opposition, but Washington was so popular that as long as he wanted to be president, he was probably going to be able to be president. But he decided before the election of 1796 that he had had enough. Remember, politicians nowadays, they're career politicians. Their job is to continue to get elected. They go as long as they can, and then they get nice cushy jobs as an advisor or an expert or members of some foundation or think tank, or basically they have it made. It's a career. Whereas the Founding Fathers, they were primarily maybe lawyers or farmers or landlords, and they wanted to eventually get out of politics. At least George Washington definitely did. He wanted to get back to Mount Vernon. Typically, politicians back then, it's not even appropriate to call them politicians. The leaders of the country, the elected officials, did so as a service, not as a career path like it's done now. But either way, in the election of 1796, Washington's popularity wouldn't matter anymore because he decided to retire. So this finally gave Republicans a chance. Now, in his farewell speech, Washington warned the country of the dangers of political parties. He encouraged nonpartisanism. It's ironic because, they were essentially established under his watch, but sort of like Eisenhower's warning against the military-industrial complex, he was able to see exactly what was going on with parties, and so he was well-placed to deliver a specific warning. Now, the election of 1796 involved shenanigans. There was some manipulation going on. Alexander Hamilton was very practical, and so he would justify doing nearly whatever it took to achieve the end that he wanted. He is going to fail, but his shenanigans will have an impact on the election. Against his wishes, though, John Adams will win the election, and then Thomas Jefferson will be a close second. Now, early on in American history, the way it was set up was president is the one who gets the most votes, and the vice president is the one who gets the second most. They did not anticipate when they made the Constitution that there would be two different political parties that were running against one another. So eventually that will be done away with. What this means is Thomas Jefferson is made the vice president, which is pretty awkward because they were not getting along at this point. So let's talk about Federalists versus Republicans. Now, as I have said, Federalists were elitist. They did not want democracy. They thought it was a very bad idea. They wanted a republic, but not a democracy. That is, they didn't want widespread voting and political participation. They supported the wealthy dominating politics and society. They preferred a strong central government that could exercise its will over the states, over the local government. They also thought that the government maybe should have a role in promoting the right types of behavior. So they felt that the interests of the best Americans were much more important than the fears of most Americans. They wanted the United States to be a world power, and they're going to take effective steps in ensuring that would happen. Now, Republicans, they're conservative. I don't think necessarily the modern connotation with conservative. They basically wanted things to go back to what they were before the Revolution or during the Revolution. They were less worried about the efficiency of the government. They were less worried about national power. They were less worried about how big the economy is. Their biggest concern was pretty consistent: keep the government weak enough so that it could not abuse the liberty of individuals. Because of ideals Republicans believed that the United States should maintain its agricultural economy. Jefferson argued that agriculture was consistent with the founding ideals of the United States, and that if materialism or capitalism or commercial expansion were the primary concerns, then people would give up their liberties in order to just obtain more wealth. That the only way that you're going to have a group of Americans who are vigilant, which again, the whole point of the United States was that a vigilant populace will keep a government from becoming too tyrannical. The only way to ruin a potential vigilance was to have people distracted by, like I said, materialist concerns. Jefferson and those like him would argue that a growing commercial economy and emphasizing a commercial economy would inevitably erode personal liberties, and that the people themselves would let it happen. All right, so John Adams is president. Now, one of the early issues for Adams as president was dealing with France and Britain. The French were mad about Jay's Treaty. Even though it didn't really help the United States, it really did more harm than good. The French are going to respond by aggressively raiding American shipping. When the Americans sought to negotiate, the French ambassador demanded a bribe before he would even listen to the negotiation. And that's going to set off a scandal, and it made the American public more hostile towards France. So in 1798, the United States will enlarge its military, especially its navy, and will wage an undeclared naval war against France, and that'll last for the next 2 years. There's also going to be a political war at home, not literally a civil war, but Republicans feared that the military buildup was just a cover-up to use the army to squash any opposition. There was a lot of fear that Hamilton and his Federalists wanted to set up a military dictatorship. So like I said, politics was a nasty business during this time. Vicious personal attacks were a daily part of politics. Pistol duels were common. It was a way that politicians settled scores from time to time. Alexander Hamilton, who we talked about, killed in a duel. So, that shows you very much a relevant thing. And this is when American partisanism fully took hold. Thomas Jefferson described it. He said that there was, quote, a wall of separation and party hatreds that separated the two political camps. Even Jefferson himself became deeply involved in party politics by 1800. Eventually, John Adams, when he was president, will say of Thomas Jefferson, quote, he became a child and the dupe, end quote, of the Republican Party establishment. One side would accuse the other of being spies for the British or for the French. One Federalist called Republicans a pack of, quote, blood-drinking cannibals, end quote. Now, the cannibal statement was considered extreme and controversial at the time, but it does show how nasty things could get. Now, oddly enough, this type of behavior encouraged more and more people to become involved in political parties. All right, so the Alien and Sedition Acts, big controversy. In 1798, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which allowed the president to arrest and deport immigrants suspected of treason or just treasonable leanings. Obviously, this could be easily abused to silence fair political opposition, and that's exactly what the Republicans feared. The Sedition Act was worse because it was a direct threat to the First Amendment. Anyone who wrote or spoke maliciously about the government could theoretically be fined or even imprisoned. I say theoretically, it was applied, it did happen, but the threat could deter free speech. And the majority of those prosecuted of sedition were Republicans. Remember, John Adams was a Federalist, his administration was Federalist, so this was seen as a partisan use of presidential power. A lot of P's there. It appeared that the Constitution was being ignored, though it must be noted that only 25 people were actually arrested, and there were only 10 convictions. It still was massively controversial. It will result in a new, broader interpretation of freedom of speech. The big element of freedom of speech originally was prior restraint, which is forbidding a certain viewpoint to be published. But the idea that you could not be held legally accountable for your opinion, that was not originally part of the First Amendment or freedom of speech. Because basically people should be allowed to say what they want, but they may have to suffer consequences. Nowadays, at least for the moment, the interpretation of freedom of speech has been broadened. That not only should you be able to say what you want, but there should be no consequences from the government, unless you like lying or whatever, which is ironic because politicians lie as much as anyone else, if not more. Anyway, part of this backlash were the Kentucky and the Virginia resolutions. And these were essentially threats that if the federal government went too far, states had the right to resist and then take matters into their own hands. There was a fear that this could lead to secession, like the American Civil War. This controversy will result in increased popularity for the Republicans, and eventually they will win the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson will be the third president. Thomas Jefferson as president. Thomas Jefferson is one of those characters that is quite complicated. Seemingly, at one point of his life, he will say something that seems to go against another quote from another part of his life. For instance, he is very strict with interpreting the Constitution. However, when it comes to the Louisiana Purchase, which we'll cover, he's like, well, let's not really think about that too much. Let's just run with it. So Jefferson worked to transfer more power into the hands of a majority of the people. Little or no political rights were gained by women or blacks, but during Jefferson's administration, and then Republican administrations after his, there was work done to expand the electorate. That is, more people than before were able to vote and participate. Jefferson did have sort of like a faith in the people, especially when you contrast it to what the elitist Federalists thought. Jefferson believed that the will of the people would eventually lead to the best path. It may be bumpy, it may involve some bloodshed here and there, depending on the situation, but that letting the people lead themselves, that was not only the right thing to do, but it was the best path. Even as president, Jefferson remained skeptical of the government and of government officials. Now, like I said earlier, Jefferson believed that agriculture should be the heart and soul of American values. He argued the life of a farmer encouraged things like independence, honesty, and pride of purpose. And don't forget, when we talk about expanding the electorate, it still needed to be property owners. And Jefferson was convinced that the ideal form of government was a republic with wide participation, but he also said that that could only survive with vigilance. You can't just let the government do its own thing and then, as long as you're getting what you want out of life, you're happy to ignore it. Jefferson did not anticipate what was coming later with the Industrial Revolution, mass culture, mass materialism, and consumerism, and things like that. But he said that in order for this whole thing to work, the population had to be willing to check and limit the power of the government, especially the federal government. And if that did not happen, then it wasn't going to work, but he believed that it would. Now, Jefferson worked to reduce the size of the government, though he also worked tirelessly to increase the size of the country. Jefferson worked to cut taxes. He wanted to cut the military budget, which he actually cut in half. Very, very significant. If you try that today, you would disappear very quickly. In fact, this video may disappear just for me saying that. Jefferson believed that militia should be the primary means of defense of the country, and that further reflected his faith in the people as the engine of the country. All right, so the next big important topic is the Louisiana Purchase. Now, as we have discussed, traveling over water is usually at least 10 times more efficient than traveling over land. This means that farmers and merchants who wanted to move a large amount of products beyond just their local market, they needed ships, they needed access to waterways. Now, for those farmers who lived in the backcountry, places like Kentucky, places like Tennessee, and then what will later become Mississippi and Alabama, which weren't states yet, the Mississippi River was their lifeblood. They could grow crops all day long, but if they couldn't get them to people to buy them, then their enterprise was going to be limited. So no large-scale commerce can take place without waterways. Not at the time. Now, where does the Mississippi River empty out into the sea? New Orleans. Now, who owned New Orleans after the 7 Years' War? Spain. Remember that? Now, Spain was on a sharp decline by the late 1700s, and many Americans thought that, well, as long as Spain held it, it would be easy to eventually take. Because, like I said, Spain's on the way down. If you remember, Spain used its control over the flow of commerce to its advantage. This is actually going to cause some Americans to want to join the Spanish Empire, and others called for a military invasion of New Orleans. So you had different ways to deal with this problem. We'll never know what would have happened if Spain had continued to hold on to New Orleans, because a series of very unexpected events is going to dramatically change history in this area. A guy named Napoleon, he's going to seize power in France. And you may be like, what the hell does that have to do with Louisiana? Napoleon had big plans for a huge, giant world empire that would make France the most dominant country in the world. Part of that plan involved France's most lucrative, profitable colony, Santo Domingo, which is modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Now, Spain, like the rest of Europe, they've been fighting against France ever since everyone declared war on them, basically for going nuts during the French Revolution. They executed Louis XVI. That was a big no-no. They did that in 1793. Well, Spain had been defeated during this war, like nearly everyone else, and they were forced to sign a treaty that was favorable to France. By the time Napoleon rose to power, France had a ton of leverage over Spain, which helped Napoleon acquire Louisiana back from Spain. Now, this was to be kept from the United States because France knew the growing, increasingly land-hungry United States wanted to continue to expand, and didn't want the United States to do anything to prevent this deal. So the United States will learn about this deal in 1801. Why is this situation bad for the U.S. though? So Napoleon wants to conquer the world. This means that if France has Louisiana, there's no way that the United States can invade and beat up on a Napoleon army. In other words, if Napoleon controls Louisiana, this means an end to American expansion, and foreign control over New Orleans becomes a permanent reality. And once the United States learns about these French plans, the U.S., led by President Thomas Jefferson, becomes desperate to negotiate. President Jefferson noted, quote, "There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans." Basically saying, because of the way things are going in this country, because of the way the map is laid out, if we don't control New Orleans, whoever does is a problem for us. The United States tries repeatedly to convince France to sell them that area, and France repeatedly turns them down. Over and over and over. The reason is the French plan is to use every inch of that Santo Domingo colony for sugar production, which is very, very lucrative. And so if you use every inch of land for sugar production, you still need food. You can't just eat sugar all day long. That may sound fun. It will end horribly. Anyway, so where are you going to get the food? Well, that's what Napoleon wanted Louisiana for. Grow the food there, ship it to feed the colony in Santo Domingo. Now, due to the overwhelming power of the French Empire, the United States had no hope to change this. They were powerless. But luck would help Louisiana fall into American hands in a very shocking way. Now, without a slave revolt, which turned into a revolution in Santo Domingo, France would have likely remained in Louisiana for a long time. Who knows, maybe even still today. So, in Santo Domingo, what you had was probably the most brutal, sadistic slave situation in human history. Slaves there were able to revolt and take over. This was the only slave uprising that led to the founding of a new country, which was both free from slavery and ruled by non-whites and former captives. It's the only time that's ever happened. Napoleon led an army of 30,000 men in order to consolidate control over Santo Domingo and then Louisiana. Now, the Haitian Rebellion, which is in Santo Domingo, goes horribly wrong for France, and the 10,000 soldiers they had planned to use to occupy Louisiana were actually now needed to reinforce the counter-rebellion in Santo Domingo. And I know I keep switching between Santo Domingo and Saint Domingo. There's so many names for it. I could say Haiti, modern-day Dominican Republic. I could say Saint Domingue, which is how the French said it. I could say Saint Dominguez, which is how a dude from the South pronounces a French word, spelled that way. So Saint Domingo, Santo Domingo, Saint Domingo, same thing, sorry. So at this point, Napoleon had kept 3,000 men to invade Louisiana. All right, so after all that, there's still 3,000 men in Europe ready to go to Louisiana. But get this, a freak ice storm in the harbor that they were supposed to embark in prevented the mission. By the time the weather cleared up, all hope was lost in Saint Domingo. The rebels won, and the French plans for Louisiana were made obsolete. As a result, Napoleon decided to cut his losses and just sell Louisiana for cheap. So what that means is, without the successful slave revolt in modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the Louisiana Purchase would have never happened, or at least not anytime soon, and the United States wouldn't have doubled its size, and then couldn't have been as powerful and expanded, and wouldn't be maybe a global power at this point. So, and then even with that, maybe if the ice storm hadn't happened, who knows? So there's so many tiny little things that happen just in the right way for the United States to get Louisiana, which doubled the size of the country. Small variable, huge difference in what happened. Truly a butterfly effect scenario. Now, during all of this, the Americans were not really keenly aware of these details, okay? James Livingston and James Monroe, they're sent to Paris and instructed to try and buy New Orleans. Again, this was done, like I said, to ensure American access to the Mississippi River. But the French ambassador gave them a shocking offer. Would you like to buy the entire Louisiana territory? And that's a big deal because it would double the country's size overnight. So this shocked the hell out of Livingston and Monroe. They almost didn't know how to respond. Nobody was expecting this. But they were only given permission to spend enough to buy the area right around the city of New Orleans. They couldn't call back home, no cell phones, no other phones, to ask what to do, so they took a chance and they offered to buy it. $15 million for 830,000 square miles. Now, constitutionally speaking, there is no explicit permission in the Constitution for the United States to expand territory by foreign treaties. Jefferson, normally the stickler for strict adherence to the document, just said, the less we talk about this, the better. And so this is yet another example of practicality trumping ideals. All right, let's talk about America's first foreign war. This is in Tunisia. For generations before the American Revolution, several small Islamic countries close to modern-day Tunisia, we're talking about Tunis, Algiers, and Tripoli, had used piracy and extortion to add to its government's income. The European states usually thought it was easier to simply pay these pirate countries protection money so that they wouldn't be attacked. Well, after the United States became independent, their ships were no longer considered protected under Britain's payments. So the United States originally paid protection money too. But all of a sudden, the leader of Tripoli, known as a pasha, significantly raised the protection price. So the United States refused this, and it led to a war. Tripolitan pirates, pirates from Tripoli, Tripolitan pirates seized any American ships it could. Eventually, the United States will blockade Tripoli and eventually forced it to surrender. In addition to the blockade, a small detachment of American Marines and a larger force of Arab, Greek, and Berber mercenaries, Berber is an ethnicity in North Africa, B-E-R, they're going to march across North Africa to attack the city of Derna. Now, this was a small but significant victory for the United States, as it was the first time in American history that the American flag was raised in victory on foreign soil. Eventually, Tripoli significantly reduced its ransom demands. It had captured the crew of the USS Philadelphia, and the Americans paid. War in Europe. How many of those do we talk about in American history? In 1804, Jefferson was reelected by a relatively wide margin. His policy of maintaining a small army and keeping the United States out of European affairs as much as possible was about to run into some trouble. A massive war was underway in Europe. Napoleonic France, Napoleon's still there, pretty much versus all. Now that may sound like France would clearly lose, but they kept kicking ass. France dominated on land, but Britain did at sea. The war was far and away the most important topic for both France and Britain. Nearly all attention was on that. So during this war, Britain was able to bully American shipping. When Britain found it in its interest to do so, their navy attacked American ships, forced many American sailors into the British Navy. This is called impressing. For a while, the United States decided, hey, what can we do about this? We have to let it go. But public anger will eventually mount, and Jefferson's popularity was hurt as a result of this, because people would argue, his opposition would argue, he's just sitting idly by, letting the United States be disrespected. So Jefferson decided to sit the next election out. He was done. He was tired of the criticism. So James Madison, he stepped in. He will be elected as the fourth American president in 1808. And that sets the stage for the War of 1812. So, the War of 1812. Eventually, the American government decided it would no longer tolerate the British interference with its shipping. But it's important to mention that the United States was also, believe it or not, hungry for land. But where? In Canada. On June 18, 1812, Congress voted for a declaration of war. Now, oddly enough, this was 2 days after the British government decided to stop raiding American shipping, but Americans didn't find out until too late, and it was not the whole reason that the United States was clamoring for war against Britain. Now, of course, Great Britain was still vastly superior to the United States in terms of military strength, but the British were busy. They were fighting Napoleon, and Napoleon had conquered nearly all of continental Europe at that point. Just to give you some time scale, 5 days after the American declaration of war, Napoleon's forces invaded Russia, and that will eventually lead to the destruction of his army and the downfall of France in Europe, or at least Napoleonic France. Either way, when the United States declared war on Britain, the American army was in a sad state. Only about 6,700 men. They were ill-equipped. They were barely trained. Though the Navy was in decent shape, the United States had 16 ships. They were top of the line. The American economy was not really designed for a war either. A lot of people think that's a good thing, by the way. Why was the American economy not set up well for war? Well, the American government had let the National Bank expire, and it was harder for the federal government to go into debt. The United States, money was still back backed by gold. And unlike today, when the government can just print money out of thin air to do what it wants, the government was very much restricted on what it could do for that reason and several others. So, long story short, which is impossible at this point because I spent too long explaining it, the U.S. government could not manipulate the economy enough to be able to have a large-scale war. To the war. The British, once this happens, immediately blockade the southern American coast and trapped much of the American fleet up north. The United States decided to immediately invade Canada. Don't forget, Canada is still a British territory at this point, not its own country. Well, the American invasion of Canada was initially a disaster. The militia refused to cross the border. They're like, wait a minute, we're here to defend the United States. We're not going to go invade another country. And they didn't cross the river. Now, army leaders made poor decisions, whether we're talking about indecisive maneuvers or taking routes and positions that gave disadvantage. Bad story for the American army. Other than a naval battle in Lake Erie that resulted in an American victory, things looked pretty bad for the United States against British forces in Canada early on. Now, things would eventually change at the Battle of the Thames, that's October 5th, which turned the tide against the British in Canada and prevented them from attacking the United States without sending more troops from Britain. And Americans knew that no reinforcements were coming as long as Napoleon's giant army dominated Europe. So the naval victories compensated for the setbacks on land. So the next part of this, I called it, Napoleon is defeated and oh crap, here come the British again. Or we could think of it as British invasion. So Napoleon was defeated and his entire empire collapsed. Sorry for skipping that amazing story, but this is American history, so we have a different amazing story to cover. This freed the British army to invade the United States and punish us and perhaps regain the United States as colonies. But by 1814, Britain had been at war for a very long time. Think about it, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, which was a global war against France and others, fighting Napoleon, now the War of 1812. Most British people were sick of war, but more importantly, British debt was, holy cow. So the British had a plan for a decisive victory and leave it at that. The British wanted to attack in three major places. From Canada, attacking the American capital on the East Coast, Washington, D.C., and then capturing New Orleans to control the all-important Mississippi River. Well, the attack from Canada failed thanks to another American naval victory there. And historians argue all the time about, despite the naval victory for the United States, Britain could have still invaded. They made a big mistake by not doing so. It would have been the largest invasion force in American history, and they just had to turn around. I'm not getting into those details unless I have specific questions, but anyway, the invasion from Canada failed, thanks to a relatively obscure naval victory that potentially saved the United States. But the British did capture Washington, D.C. They burned the White House. The British officers actually ate a meal intended for the president, so they barely got out of there. They burned everything except the patent office. So if the British ever go to war with us again and invade, go to the patent office. Add to the burning of the Capitol, just to make it more interesting, there was a tornado the next day, and then the accompanying thunderstorm actually helped put fires out and slow down the British from pursuing the president and the American army. Now, after this, the British turned their attention to capturing and destroying Baltimore, which was the fourth largest city in the United States at the time. But American forces, which were mostly militia, held the city against British forces. Now, this is when what became known as the Star-Spangled Banner was written. Now, it wasn't the national anthem right off the bat. It was a nice poem. Actually, it was made into a song by matching it up with an English drinking song for the tune, and eventually became the national anthem, like 100 years later. All right, so the Battle of New Orleans. After the American successes in the North and in Baltimore, the British needed a victory in New Orleans to keep the war going. Now, Andrew Jackson, a later president, becomes well known to history as a result of this battle. Earlier in 1814, he invaded Florida. That was before Florida was part of the United States. And he actually did this without permission from anybody. He did this to preempt any British attempts to attack the United States from there. He also fought a series of battles against Native American tribes who allied themselves with other natives which were fighting with the British. And by the time the British arrived and were ready for battle, Jackson had assembled his force and prepared adequate defenses. Much of Jackson's army was militia, frontiersmen, free blacks, Creoles, and pirates. Probably one of the most interesting mixes of people in an army fighting on the same time in human history. It's amazing. The arrogant British general thought that he could easily win, like they do, He attacked the well-positioned, well-defended American force, and Jackson's force won handily. It was a dramatic blowout. Now, the end of the war. The Battle of New Orleans actually took place 2 weeks after the war was officially over. American negotiators in Europe had secured a treaty, and word had not reached New Orleans until about a month later. Now, this wasn't just a defeat for the British, though. This was a defeat for the Federalists as well. Now, during the war, many prominent Federalists were so actively against the war that they appeared to be undercutting the national effort to defeat the British. They were opposing the war even as American armies were succeeding on the battlefields. A lot of people interpreted this as the Federalists being on the wrong side of history. Ironically, though, the Federalists were playing the role of the Republicans. They wanted a decrease in the power of the federal government at this point. They had pretty reasonable objections to what the War of 1812 would do to the United States in terms of enhancing federal government power and changing the values, bigger issues that we'll talk about later. And if that confuses you, that means you're paying attention because, yes, that used to be what the Republicans were doing. In the election of 1816, James Monroe, another Republican, will be elected and become the 5th president. Now, after the victory in the War of 1812, after the Louisiana Purchase, we have a brand new thing going on in American history that becomes the dominant theme for a while, several decades. And that is the issue of westward expansion. Expanding west will be a constant theme for most of American history. Expansion was important for several reasons. Under normal circumstances, when a population of a certain country grows rapidly, this usually creates several problems. In agricultural areas, it can create a land squeeze, which leads to unemployment and eventually political unrest. In urban areas, it can lead to overpopulation and shrinking wages, that is, people being paid less because there's more of a supply of workers than there is a demand for them. Now, since these problems are very serious and can even result in economic depressions or political revolutions or even fallen governments, countries are desperate for ways to avoid this. And so this is why westward expansion was so important. It was more than just a land of opportunity for Americans looking for a fresh start. It was potentially an easy solution to an otherwise very serious problem. A place for people to go, opportunity for people who might not have it otherwise, which is, again, why the Louisiana Purchase was such a big deal. So places to put people, and it continuously fed a growing economy.